Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today in person and online. My name is Annie. So imagine you're an 18 years old newcomer coming to Vancouver to study. It's your first time here. It's also your first time renting. You have no network here, no parents around you, no one to be a reference. You work part-time, but you still struggle to find a place to stay. This is my story, and my experience is just a snapshot of the global youth housing crisis. More youth will be in urban centers globally more than ever. Their lived experience, privilege, and disadvantage will shape their trajectory to housing. However, the challenges to access housing remain under-researched. We need a holistic and global understanding of the issue. In collaboration with our client, UN Habitat, we have been working to fill this knowledge gap of youth housing challenges at the global level and identify the hurdles that block youth from accessing housing. Today, we will present to you the purpose of this project, the barriers for youth to access housing, with insights on promising practices and potential intervention points moving forward. The aim of this project is to undertake a global review of the challenges and practices surrounding youth housing and to develop a global understanding of the unique youth housing issues across Global North and Global South. Based on considerations such as the pace of urbanization, the size of the youth population, housing affordabilities, our team has looked into 10 urban cities across regions. We then zoom in on specific cities, those highlighted in blue here, which have some of the most pressing youth housing needs. For example, Vancouver is the most unaffordable city in North America, and Nairobi is a city with fast-growing youth population and informal housing challenge. Drawing on multidisciplinary literature and interviews, our team has identified 4 critical barriers that youth face across urban centers. Now, Priya will have more to share.
Thank you, Annie. So through our literature review, country-based case studies, and expert interviews, we identified 20 key recurring themes that youth face in accessing safe, affordable, and adequate housing in urban cities. From there, we categorize these challenges into 4 key barriers: institutional, financial, operational, and life experiences, which will assist UN Habitat in navigating entry points to action. On that note, I'd first like to acknowledge that while we had access to so many different search tools and research materials, we found that it's not easy to measure the complexity and magnitude of people's experiences through standardized metrics, especially since conducting interviews on vulnerable populations like youth experiencing homelessness was not an option for us. So gaining access to quantitative data about the barriers youth face in accessing safe, adequate, and affordable housing was a persistent challenge and a major limitation of this project. While housing challenges can vary on a personal level, we hope that with our research findings and narrowing down the challenges youth face into concise categories, we can help influence decision makers to adopt solutions that better align with the experiences and needs of youth in the global housing and urban planning development. Moving on to the first barrier. Financial barriers are faced by people all over the globe, especially vulnerable populations like youth. Through our research, we found that a lack of proper financial frameworks lead to barriers to adequate housing and pose a major threat to youth trying to secure housing. Financial barriers include a lack of government investment in housing due to poor funding for government bodies, ease of access to borrowing, cost of living relative to income, and high upfront costs for renting, like security deposits. As an example, in an interview, former Vancouver City Councillor Raymond Louis let us know that municipalities run on a very thin budget because the local government only receives about 10 or 12 cents from every tax dollar that Canadians pay. They need to provide residents with an extensive list of needed services and resources like clean water and waste management, So if there is to be a solution for addressing affordable housing supply, there needs to be sustained and resilient funding that is targeted to the needs of each jurisdiction. The next barrier I'll talk about is institutional barriers. So institutional barriers capture the various challenges that can arise from limitations in laws, policies, and regulations across the housing sector. For example, many people working in cities like Bogota and Sao Paulo in the informal economy or who live in informal settlements are unable to get the proper services they need as they don't meet their requirements for services like government rental subsidies, mortgages, or other low-income accommodation. This insecure tenure translates into lacking a legal address, which in turn makes households invisible to the wider society, uncounted in censuses, and once again, ineligible for receiving basic services offered by local and national government. Now I'll pass it off to Dariel, who will talk about the next two barriers.
Thank you so much, Priya. I'll be going over 2 additional barriers that youth face in accessing safe, affordable, and adequate housing. According to our findings, these barriers are operational barriers and life experience barriers. So operational barriers refer to issues that prevent the coordination and efficiency of organizations, institutions, and decision makers in meeting policy goals or outcomes. This can include conditions or attitudes that might prevent effective housing delivery, which meets the needs of youth. Another component of operational barriers are contextual considerations, which examine the macroeconomic housing challenges facing youth. Having stable employment allows youth to earn income and thus influences the choices they make around their living arrangements. In sub-Saharan Africa, unemployment is highest among educated urban youth, and there is a mismatch between youth and labor supply. In South Korea, social competition is so fierce that it's extremely difficult for highly educated youth to find work. In Europe, for youth without a stable income, purchasing a home may not be a possibility. Rental markets become harder to access, and the effects of discouragement only add fuel to the fire. Rental and home ownership affordability is another major factor. Within Canada, 85% of youth in Vancouver feel that it's virtually impossible for young people to be able to buy a house today. High rents in urban settings therefore remain a key barrier, blocking youth with limited earnings and savings from obtaining affordable housing. And the next barrier is life experience barriers, which can arise from overly regulated social systems, which can be difficult for youth to use. Additionally, individuals with unique backgrounds, such as differently abled youth, those of lower income levels, and LGBTQ+ youth, have the most challenges in securing housing or finding services catered to them. Resources and networks are critical to transitions to adulthood, yet inequity exists in the opportunities for youth to transition to independent living. And those with higher economic resources are advantaged. In South Korea, many youth are being forced to stay home longer than they usually would, or choosing not to get married due to a lack of sufficient understanding of how the housing market operates. This is due to a lack of proper educational frameworks within the public schooling systems to guide youth through their transitions into the housing market. Parents who have strong financial literacy or understanding of the housing market are more likely to have children who will inherit this knowledge. Youth in Kenya are experiencing low levels of financial literacy, which can pose threats to their future financial opportunities. In response to gaps in financial literacy, governments in Europe have been working to enact policies that treat youth as a vulnerable population group in regards to housing. To help mitigate these barriers, Samira will be speaking to you about some promising practices we have observed in our research.
Thank you, Dariel. Now that our team has presented the key barriers and related challenges you face across the housing sector, I'll quickly highlight some promising practices to how UN Habitat can move forward in addressing these challenges. Regarding financial, more equitable distribution on financial resources to support the housing needs of youth, particularly in disadvantaged municipalities and territories, is required. Government should increase territorial budgets to financially support municipalities in accessing or in increasing affordable and adequate housing supply, and the relevant non-economic resources youth need for their well-being. In the case of institutional, lack of formal regulations around rental housing can be addressed by strengthening or implementing rental tenancy laws to ensure that landlords and tenants are safeguarded. Further, looking at informal settlements, states have the power to implement laws that recognize the legitimacy of informal settlements, even when these households do not meet current legal standards for zoning and land titles. By legalizing informal settlements, states are able to account for those currently invisible to the wider society and also provide households with much needed services to increase their well-being. In terms of operational, by reviewing the operative frameworks and administrative processes across the housing sector, formal institutions can streamline any redundant or excessive costly regulations in order to increase efficiency. The private sector is a promising space to gain insight on how this can be done. In regards to life experience, we need to ensure that our policies and programs are designed in a way that it works for everyone. The recent pandemic has allowed the opportunity in how we can interact with one another digitally. Local jurisdictions can promote youth participation by holding virtual public hearings so that a safe, accessible, and anonymous space can be created to inform policy decisions. By strengthening these foundational pillars, we can effectively move towards creating prosperous cities for all. Now, Jamal will speak to the relevant intervention points policy practitioners can consider when addressing the youth housing needs between the ages of 18 to 29.
Thanks, Samira. So basically, you've gone through sort of these macroeconomic factors and these big overlying things about these barriers youth face, some of these larger interventions that we could possibly go through, some promising practices. One thing is, what is it really like for youth? What is it like for youth that are transitioning towards adulthood, that are learning, that are in school, that start a family early? And we've sort of come up with this life process. And through this life process, there's many different interventions that youth need depending on where they are. If we bring back the person that we talked about in the beginning, this experience is for many youth around the world. Many youth go through, they're in school, they don't have their family here, they don't have these social supports like they do at home. So what can we do, or what can policymakers do? So if we walk through the timeline here, we go into school, perhaps there's an early withdrawal, perhaps can't pay for rent. We have to decide, do we want to stay in school or do we want housing? They go with the housing. So we get out of school and then now we're thrusted with all of these problems. First and foremost, some financial literacy, understanding how to manage interest rates from loans that they take out maybe. What is overdraft? What do these things mean when they're trying to access housing, when they're having this transition? Possibly some career supports. How do they leverage the skills that they got in this little time of school to actually help pay for their rent, to help get them get a job that helps them push them towards adulthood? Social support services, tangible services, emotional support services, something that youth can rely on to help them through this really hard transition in their life and to help them really attain the housing that they need. And possibly home support ownership. They're looking to the future. They're looking, what do I need to do eventually to get a home? How can I prepare to buy a mortgage? How can I prepare some funds? How can I build up my savings? And throughout the whole process, there's really some common themes of home ownership supports, social support services that can really push youth up, that can help them feel comfortable in their lives, that can help them get better jobs, get the income that they need in order to attain this safe, accessible, and affordable housing. And really some of the youth that we see that are able to walk through this process very well need less of the social supports, but still need supports around how to get home ownership, how to leverage their career skills. Those that kind of go through school, finish school, have start a family, are very comfortable. That sort of last point, number 7, there are these kind of youth that need less, but because they need less doesn't mean that they don't need anything at all. And really these different intervention points can jump from one place to another. We can go through school, we can feel very comfortable. All of a sudden something happens and we're propelled somewhere else in this timeline. And these supports really can support youth that want to attain housing and transition to adulthood. However, this also looks different all around the world. We are youth that are born mostly in wealthy areas, and this is sort of how we see. So this can really take a different spin when we apply it to the broader world. And I'm going to pass it off to Annie to finish this off.
Thank you. So just to conclude, what separates youth and adult is not simply age or income, but the knowledge, needs, and experience around housing. Having holistic support that makes housing an enabler for independence and success is key for young people to achieve the future that they envision. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
All right, well done, everyone. I am, of course, looking forward to retirement housing rather than youth housing, but riveted by your remarks in any case. Simon, at UN Habitat, you've heard the report, but unfortunately the connection hasn't worked out, so I won't be turning to you. And instead, Tara Cookson, our SPPGA colleague, has been working with the team all year. Tara, some comments or questions?
Yes. Can I speak, or do I need to write them in the chat?
Go ahead and speak, Tara. We can hear you well.
Okay, sorry I couldn't be there with you all in person today. One of the things about this project that was so striking to me was the enormous evidence gap around youth housing transitions and evidence on what works in various contexts. So I think this team did a really remarkable job of surveying a rather patchy global literature and doing some great consultations to kind of bring that rich qualitative element. And one of the things that I wondered if the team could chat about a little bit more were one or two promising practices that you thought really stuck out, that really kind of hit the nail on the head. This is something in my own work with UN organizations that they're always asking for, like, who's doing something that we could look to for inspiration. So from your review of around the world, one or two practices that you think we should really be sort of paying attention to.
Thank you for the question, Professor, and your compliments. Personally, as our team has discussed, there is no just one of the things I would say that really stuck out with our team is ensuring that within our institutions, when we increase participation for youth, there can be opportunities for filling that knowledge gap that exists. So for instance, when I mentioned a promising practice for youth engagement in terms of virtualizing or virtually holding public hearings, this is an opportunity, for instance, for government officials to interact with youth, collect the information that they need to inform censuses. Further, I think when informal settlements, when there's 300 million people who are in dire needs of housing needs in that sector, by just legalizing their status can allow us to not only provide services to them in times of need, especially during COVID, but it allows individuals, especially children who live within informal settlements, to have a brighter future. So I think a lot of promising practices really align with the political will and within our institutions to kind of, if we have policies in place, but there's certain gaps, I think we can really strengthen them by just tweaking them a little bit so that we include everyone. Not sure if anyone wants to.
Thank you, Samira. That was a really good answer. I would just like to add on, I think that all of us did a lot of really great regional research, and we came up with so many different examples. I know for myself, I was working on Asia and North America research, and within that research, I saw so many interesting practices that I had no idea about. Specific example, in South Korea that I was researching a lot, there's actually a lot of programs where they can send youth to still urban areas, but they've been less developed, or areas that are just not as popular for youth. And they actually help them start businesses there, and the government subsidizes them for building small communities of youth. So I thought that was a really interesting, just specific example. Another in North America, there's so many programs in Canada. So I know Annie and I were working hard on that research. So maybe Annie, do you have any examples?
Thank you, and thanks, Professor, for a question. I think when the question about promising practice, I think one thing to bear in mind is whether it's fitting the needs of youth, and this is still under research. We need to first understand the unique needs of different youth population, and then tailor housing that fit their needs. This is super important. So one of the limitations we mentioned also is data. So if we can gather more insights and data around this, that would help in improving practices. But then speak to some specific practices that I came across would be, for example, housing. Give youth more option, just not like ordinary housing. That element of social support is really important. I think in Sweden, there's one youth housing that's, youth living with incoming refugee youth. So in that way, they're not only sharing the space, but sharing life experience and support. Or some co-living arrangement in Taiwan, like elderly would live with young people. In that way, they take care of each other, share life experience again. So how do we incorporate housing with this consideration in mind? I think is really crucial. Housing is just not housing. We have to also implement certain support and take into consideration what kind of social policy can be in place to support youth.
Fantastic. Tara, anything to follow up? An additional question?
No, I think that's great. I think that's one of the strengths of this team, is that they're filling an evidence gap, both in terms of what the kind of challenges are in the sector, and also interventions that could have some evidence-based review of them as well. So looking currently and looking forward. So thanks, team.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tara. Simon and Olga, we've launched into the question period already, but you've been working with the team all spring, and we're very grateful for your collaboration. Any comments or questions you have to the team?
Hello, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Great. I just wanted to say big thanks to the team for their incredible work that they've done. I mean, that was a big pleasure to be part of such a big enterprise. I was just joining as support for Douglas Reagan, who is the project manager at Human Rights and Social Inclusion Unit of UN Habitat. And from the very inception, it was very interesting to see what the development of the idea, the concept of the project, and now the outcomes. So thank you very much for having such an incredible work done. And yes, I'm just passing it over to Simon for his comments and remarks. Over.
I think Simon may be mute, but anyways, let me jump in here too and apologize for some technical difficulties in getting on. Yeah, so my name is Doug Reagan, and I head up the Human Rights and Social Inclusion Unit, the youth stream. And yeah, we were really honored to have this. I mean, this came about actually over a very long period of time, predating this class, in terms of discussions with other universities actually about how there's a gap in knowledge about youth housing policy, both at I would suggest, I'm also from Vancouver, at a national level and a local level, but also a global level. So this is a really critical piece that we hope to use and hopefully maybe work even more with you guys to be able to expand the research and see how it can apply in government, in the Canadian government, in the Canadian context, but as well globally. So yeah, really big thanks for all your work. I know you've connected with a lot of our partners in South Korea and Brazil and different places. And I think they've also reported back that it's been really great partnership. So great content, really good research. And I think it's a starting point for I would hope, a series of or more research that we can do in this area. Also, just like to do a big shout out as well to Andrea Reimer, who kind of started this process and brought me into this process as well, and UN Habitat. So big thanks to her too. So thank you, everyone.
Terrific. Thank you, Doug. Good to hear from you. Tina, do we have Zoom questions? Room, start formulating your questions if you have them. Andrea has a question. How unsurprising.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for that. I'm sorry, I'm a bit off camera here so that you can look at the students. But I did have a question for the students. You are all either currently youth under the definition or very recently youth. So I'm curious about how you connected. Yeah, I'm not naming names, guys. But curious about how you found, because you've all struggled with this at some point, right? So how did you do the research and kind of set aside your own, potential biases or viewpoint and bring it out to more of a policy maker viewpoint?
Yeah, such a great question. And like researching the youth housing crisis as a youth eventually trying to find housing very, very soon is kind of like this daunting feeling. But I think some of those things that we held were served as points to break down, like what beliefs that we had that we could break down, and through research, how could we really understand this sort of more worldly, holistic view? Personally for me, like growing up in Canada and like understanding that the problems that I have here they're kind of unique, but at the same time, like they exist around the world in some ways or another, especially around like the idea of, if we ask people about affordability, it's sort of this global thing. So, I mean, not a global, in a lot of like big cities, affordability is really hard. So taking this idea that I know it's expensive here, but what does that mean for someone else? What does that mean for someone living in Brazil or someone living in Nairobi? Was one thing that I kept thinking about.
I think personally for myself, I used to be a financial manager for a few years. So I dealt with a lot of lending, mortgages. And I think through my research, what really struck for me is when I was a lender, I would look at someone's credit score, someone's savings, and I wouldn't look at it in a holistic manner of saying this individual who is 29 years old trying to get a pre-approval, they have bad credit. I wouldn't scope and probe to see why that was the causal. I would definitely just say this person is a risky individual or whatnot. There was no mitigation. But then doing the literature review, I started for sure realizing how my actions, being a financial manager, being a power holder, could impact this individual's life by taking that away from them instead of probing and asking questions and trying to mitigate their circumstances. And I think a lot of people who are in positions that can give opportunities to youth need to recognize that not everyone has a perfect life. We all go through challenges. And I think if we can provide opportunities for people in any way, it's a great way that you don't have to necessarily pay money to give someone an opportunity. You can just listen to them. So.
Personally, for me, when I started doing research on which kind of region I wanted to focus on, I used to volunteer for YMCA Immigration Services with newcomers and refugees as well. So I kind of had some insights on their experience coming to Vancouver for the first time and their barriers, like financial barriers and then language barriers and whatnot. And so based on that insight, I sort of picked regions based on their experiences that they informed me of. And so I kind of had that sort of insider knowledge, and that's what informed, my research.
One quick point. I think one of the strengths of our team is that we bring in different knowledge and expertise and experience. Like for me, my background is journalism. I have worked with vulnerable youth, homeless youth living aging out of care. So I always remind, like, I think our team take a critical approach, like always ask, have we assumed anything? Did we miss any group? We try to incorporate as many groups as possible within the youth definition. Is so broad, but then we also keep in mind that this is a global project. So while we understand there's limitation, but we really try to get as much insights as possible, at least from literature review or like just the interviews that we've done. So hopefully we can achieve a holistic, inclusive findings to the client.